Okay. So Dr. Osborne, he coached the Huskers for a quarter of a century. Obviously, one of the most successful football coaches in the country. And his numbers are crazy good. 255 wins, 49 losses, 3 ties. We all remember ties, right? Back in the day. Coach Osborne, of course, as we know, led the team to 3 national championships, 13 conference championships. His teams never lost under 9 games in a season. He was indicted? No, he was inducted. Just kidding. He was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 1999. Just a joke. When he retired from coaching football, he wasn't done as being a leader. So he served as congressman from Nebraska's 3rd District for 3 terms. Then he decided to come back and be the athletic director at the University of Nebraska, led the Husker sports programs until 2013. He now has the Teammates Mentoring Program, which will benefit from your generosity tonight in the auction items. It was all started by Coach and his wife Nancy in 1991. It has provided mentors for literally thousands of youngsters, young people, over the years since that time, people across the country. He is our hero, he is our icon, and he's a very, very nice man. Please welcome Dr. Tom Osborne.
Thank you very much. Is this on? It is now. Okay. Well, you've been very kind and also very generous, and we certainly appreciate that. I want to thank Brian. He's obviously gone to a lot of work, and I know there's some other people here that have also contributed greatly. And as you can see, I'm getting older. Got up early this morning and drove out here, and long drive. And I began to realize that I'm getting up in years. And this was really driven home to me the other day. I was asked to go see somebody in a nursing home. And I get a lot of requests like this to go visit people that are kind of at the final stages of their life. And it was a very large nursing home. I was wandering around trying to find a room, and was having trouble finding it. And I finally saw this nice little old lady coming down the hallway, and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am." I said, I'm looking for this room and I can't find it. She said, "Oh, you poor dear." She said, "You just go to the front desk and they'll tell you who you are." And so that kind of stuff starts happening to you, you know, you're getting pretty old. Well, you know, many times things really aren't as they seem. And tell you a story that I think kind of illustrates this. There was a friend of mine who had been out of work for quite some time. And he lived in Omaha, and he was looking for work. And one day he was driving by the zoo, and he saw a sign out in front that said "Help Wanted." So he went in and he asked about the zoo, and asked the director of the zoo what the job was. And the director said, "Well, we're kind of embarrassed, but our gorilla died." And we looked everywhere, all around the world, and we can't find a gorilla. But every great zoo has to have a gorilla, so we do have this gorilla suit. And that's the job. Somebody's going to have to dress up in a gorilla suit and pretend to be a gorilla until we can find a real one. Well, the guy wasn't wild about it, but he really needed to work, so he said, okay. So he took it home, practiced a little bit, came to work, and nobody seemed to have any idea that he wasn't a real gorilla. But then he got kind of bored because there's only so many things you can do as a gorilla in a zoo. And so he went into the director and said, "How would it be if we spiced up my act a little bit? We can build a big trapeze and I'll swing back and forth over all the other animals' cages and add a little excitement around here." And the director said, "Well, that sounds like a good idea." So they built this huge trapeze. And he was swinging back and forth and drawing some really good crowds, and things were going well. And then one day a tragedy happened. The swing broke. And he fell right on his head in the lion's cage and was not cold. And when he came to, the lion was standing over him on all fours and looking down. And then, of course, he forgot all about being a drill and began to holler for help. He said, "Help, help, somebody save me." And the lion looked down at me and said, "Shut up, stupid, or you're going to ruin this for everybody." So the reason I tell you that story is that many times really things aren't as they seem. You know, we live in a fairly affluent country, and on the surface, it would seem that most young people are doing pretty well. Most of them have their material needs fairly well taken care of. There's some poverty certainly, but by world standards, our kids that live in poverty are reasonably well off compared to other places. Most of them have some kind of designer jeans and tennis shoes and cell phones, and they have access to education. In one way or another, they are able to get health care. And so you'd say things are going pretty well. But on the other hand, there's some things that have not gone so well. And over 36 years of coaching, I saw a lot of changes. And when I first started coaching, the number of kids that I ran into that didn't have both biological parents was very small, maybe 5%. Today it's over 50%. And so we saw a lot more kids who were in dysfunctional situations, and then of course the drug culture hit, and some of the influences of the media were always that positive. So things began to change, and I noticed that over all those years, I was spending more and more time with off-the-field issues and less time with X's and O's and practice schedules and the things that you normally would do as a coach. And so in 1991, I came home from work one day, and Nancy had been watching a television show and had seen an elderly guy who had visited his 8th grade graduation, and he asked the principal how many of those kids at that school, he'd gone there 50 years before, and it had been a very different type of school, how many of these kids would go to college. And the principal said about how if we're lucky it'll be one. And so the guy was really shocked, and he said, "Now, a few kids will stay out of trouble and graduate from high school, I'll pay your way to college." He made some money in the business world. So Nancy was impressed. She said, there's something that we could do like that. And I said, "Well, I'm not quite ready to put an elementary school through college at this point, but I'll see what we can do." So I got in front of our team the next day, and I said, "How many of you guys would be willing to serve as a mentor to a 7th or 8th grade boy, Lincoln Public Schools?" And 22 hands went up, and so we matched them up with kids that were chosen by teachers and counselors as being kids that would need a mentor. And as time went on, these kids got to be seniors in high school. Of the 22, 21 graduated on time, which surprised us because we thought if we got half of them through, that'd be pretty good. And we got some money together and offered them scholarships, and of the 22, 18 went on to college. And we thought, well, if we got 4 or 5 of them through to college, that'd be good. So we were encouraged, and we expanded the program. And so today we're mentoring 8,000 kids in 135 communities all across Nebraska and Iowa. So the reason I mention this to you is that there has been mention tonight about some of the money going to teammates, and I just wanted you to know what it's going for. And we know that it works. We know it makes a huge difference. And so we appreciate your generosity and appreciate you doing this. And I know that's not why you asked me to come here, so I'm not going to spend any more time on teammates. And what I would like to do, having gotten older, you tend to live in the past a lot. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the last game that I coached. And this goes back to January 1998. We played Tennessee in the Orange Bowl. And it seemed like the more important the game, the more press conferences you had to go to. So we had players and coaches at this press conference, and we all standing around kind of bored. And I ended up standing next to Philip Fulmer, the head coach at Tennessee. And pretty soon he started talking to me about his quarterback, Peyton Manning. And he was telling me how smart Peyton Manning was, how bright he was, how intelligent he was, and on and on. And apparently I wasn't looking very impressed. So he said, I'll prove it to you. So he called Peyton over. He said, Peyton, I'm going to ask you a question. Why don't you answer it? And Peyton said, okay. He said, Peyton, he said, who is your father's brother's nephew? Peyton thought a minute. He said, well, that's me. Philip turned to me and said, well, I tell you, the guy's a genius. And I didn't want to be outdone. You can lose a game right at the press conference if you're not pretty sharp. And so I said, our quarterback, Scott Frost, will get that very easily. He's a pretty smart guy, too. So I called Scott over and I said, Scott, I'm going to ask you a question. Why don't you answer it? Okay, I said, Scott, who's your father's brother's nephew? And he thought a minute. He said, that's kind of a tough question. He said, give me a minute. I said, okay. So he kind of wandered off. He saw Frankie Lennon, our number 2 quarterback, over in the corner. And he said, hey, Frankie, he said, I need some help. He said, who is your father's brother's nephew? Frankie thought a minute. He said, well, that's me. So Scott came back over and he tapped me on the shoulder. He said, hey, coach. He said, I got it. I said, what is it? He said, it's Frankie Lennon. I said, Scott, you nodded it. I said, it isn't Frankie London, it's Peyton Manning. And I said, when you get over and tell Philip Fulmer what the right answer is, Philip was very surprised when he got it. But anyway, if I had been pretty smart, we would have gotten beat right there at the press conference. And so anyway, what I want to talk to you about tonight is, again, kind of going back in history. And some of the players here tonight were part of that. And so 1962 was when Bob Devaney came to Nebraska. And that was when I ended my short and rather nondescript professional career and went back to the University of Nebraska. And I came actually the same time as Bob, January of 1962. So I was kind of an observer to what happened, because between 1940 and 1962, period of 21 years, Nebraska, I think, had only had 2 winning seasons, no championships. And when I say winning seasons, it was like maybe 5 wins and 4 losses or something like that. So they really had a dismal period of time. And the first year, Bob goes 9-2. You know, people couldn't believe it. And he had 4 straight Big 8 championships and turned the thing around. And so I was a very small part of that. I was a graduate assistant, and I became assistant, and then some other things, coordinator. But those were interesting times. And so Bob was a coach for 11 years. And for some reason, he tapped me on the shoulder and said he wanted me to take over. And I did 25 years. And Frank Solich played for Bob. He was with me for 19 years as an assistant. And then he was there for 6 years. So the reason I mentioned that 42-year span is that there was a fairly common culture during that period of time. The approach was somewhat similar. And so I want to talk to you about that a little bit tonight. Maybe reflect on some of the things that seemed apparent to me as to why that was. Because during that 42-year period, Nebraska won 82% of their games. And I know how you guys are. You say, well, what about the other 18%? That's not so great. But interestingly, over that 42-year period, the next school in terms of winning percentage was Ohio State, and they won 75% of their games. We won 60 more games than any other team during that 42-year period. That's 1.5 games a year. So statistically speaking, that's pretty significant. So something must have happened that was fairly dramatic during that period of time. And even, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I think even 54 years later, since 1962, Nebraska probably still has the best winning percentage over the last 54 years. Now that gap certainly has narrowed in recent years, and we may have been surpassed by Ohio State, but I don't think so. So anyway, I'm going to reflect on some of the things that I think had to do with that. First of all, we had an identity. Bob Devaney was a nice guy, great sense of humor, had a good touch with people. But he's also a tough guy. You know, he kind of came up the hard way. He was a boxer, and he took a physical approach to the game. I mean, he expected pretty hard-nosed play, and that was part of our identity, and that never changed during those 42 years. And so lots of times you guys were upset that I didn't throw the ball more, and I didn't use more fancy stuff, and it was straight ahead, and it was brutal, and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes it was effective. And so anyway, the identity was there. So during those early years, the Big Eight had different standards than the other conferences. We had 45 initial grants a year. We had no upper limit. So we had about 150 kids on scholarship. And that was true throughout the Big Eight Conference. Now, lots of other schools had pretty high limits too, but we probably had a pretty good situation. So in 1971, when Jeff played, Nebraska was number 1, Oklahoma was number 2, Colorado was number 3. And that wasn't entirely by accident. The Big Eight was really strong. I mean, Oklahoma and Colorado were good. Missouri was always good. During those years, Kansas was very good. Oklahoma State, most years, was pretty good. And so we were a very strong league at that time. 73, they made some changes, and they said, we're going to have a national standard on scholarships. So I think the first thing was 135 total scholarships, and the initials were 35. And then they changed and they kept whittling it down a little bit every year. And so we said, well, we're going to have to do something to compensate. And so we really got serious about walk-ons at that point. And lots of people talk about the walk-on program. And usually that's, people say, yeah, you come and try out if you want. But there's a difference between that approach and going and sitting in those kids' living room and going and visiting their high school coach and recruiting them exactly like you did a scholarship player, and also treating those kids exactly the same as a scholarship player. Most of the players on our team, as time went on, couldn't tell you who was a walk-on and who was a scholarship player. And it didn't make any difference whether you were highly recruited or not. If you were better than the guy ahead of you, you moved up. And if you weren't, you moved down. And so over time, eventually we got to where about half of our team was walk-on players. Most all those kids were from Nebraska. A lot of them were from small towns, a lot of them were from farms. And they had a great work ethic and usually had pretty good character. And they really wanted to be there. And they were overachievers. And pretty soon, their attitude began to permeate the team. And so I remember sitting next to Doug Coleman one time, and Doug, we were on an airplane going somewhere. Doug was a heavily recruited player from New Jersey. He said, you know, I went to Nebraska because I felt it was a high-profile program and maybe I'd get in the NFL a little quicker from Nebraska. He said, you know, something kind of funny happened along the way. I saw those walk-on guys and I saw how hard they worked and how much they would sacrifice and how those guys would stay out there for 4 years and be on the scout team just to maybe have a chance to run down on a kickoff or get a letter at some point. He said, and that, pretty soon that attitude began to permeate the whole deal. And it affected all of us. And so the culture changed some, but it was very important. And so what I'm going to do is very quickly try to talk about 3 or 4 things that came from the players. So lots of books were written about a period of time that was pretty good football. And they asked the players, before they did it, wrote a book or two. One of them was called The Heart of a Husker. What was it that you remember? What do you think was significant about that program during that period of time? And one thing that most of them said, that we felt that they really cared about us as people. They cared about us, but not just because of what we could do on Saturday afternoon. They cared about us, even if we were scout team players, we were on the fourth team. They still cared about our health. They cared about our education. They knew our names, and they cared about our family. And that made a difference. And so I think that was true, that we did care about them. And so there's this principle, the 99 and the 1. What it means is that how the 1 is treated affects the 99. I remember one time I was playing with the 49ers, and we were playing the Packers. And our coach got up and he said, Jim Ringo is a great center that the Packers have. He's all pro. But we know he's got a bad knee. And when he lines up on a punt, his deep snap, we're going to put a guy on each shoulder. We don't know which knee is bad, but we're going to go after both knees. And we'll see what happens. So they did. They carried him off on a stretcher. And I remember how that affected me because Jim Ringo was on the other team. But I realized that if that coach would do that to Jim Ringo, when push came to shove, he wasn't going to worry about me. He wasn't going to worry about anybody on my team. And so what I'm getting at is that how the janitor's treated, how the secretary's treated, how the little guy on the totem pole, the scout team player, how those guys are treated affects everybody. Mm-hmm. And everybody has a function. And if everybody is valued, and everybody's treated with respect, everybody's cared for, it begins to permeate the culture. And I think that was part of it. That's something that players recognize. Second thing that they mentioned that I thought was worthy of note was integrity. And integrity really consists of two things. One is telling the truth, and the second is keeping promises. If you tell the truth and you keep promises, then I guess you would be a person of integrity. And so, if you think about it, we, during that 42-year period, never got nailed with any sanctions. And I'm not saying we were perfect, but we stayed clear of anything that was going to get us in trouble. And if you got put on probation with sanctions, took away scholarships, took bowl games away, you're going to set you back 7-8 years. And so a lot of major schools ran into that. We didn't happen to have that. And we think that was important. And so the players said this, we weren't really promised anything. And so at one time, it was kind of the wild, wild west. The Southwest Conference went belly up pretty much because almost every school down there was on probation. We had 2 schools in our league that were going after it big time. And it was cars and clothes and cash. And we didn't do that, but something that persists to this day is promising playing time. You're so good that you're going to be able to start for us as a freshman. You're so good, we're going to change our offense for you. 17-year-old high school kid, we're going to change the whole offense for you. And kids tend to believe what they want to hear. And so they said there weren't any deals. And so we lost some players. We lost some kids that wanted a quick fix. But for the most part, we lost the right ones. And for the most part, the right ones came, the ones that weren't looking for anything special. So I think that was important. They also mentioned that it was a generally positive environment. And we had some guys that would fly off the handle a little bit. Charlie McBride wasn't always real evil, even keeled. But when practice was over, he'd always have his arm around that guy. And so Lou Holtz called me one time, and he was coaching at Arkansas. And at that time, this was before ESPN. On ESPN, Lou had all the answers. But when he was coaching, he didn't have all the answers. He said, I'd like to come up here and visit Nebraska. And I never had a coach call and come up and visit during the season. And I said, sure, come on up, Lou. And he had an open date. So he came up and he hung around for a couple days, sat in our meetings, watched practice. And before he left, he said, I'd never seen a place where your coaches were as positive. And I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. He said, I never experienced that. And so I said, well, that's by design. And that's the way we want it. So often people equate coaching with tearing kids down, with criticizing, with denigrating, humiliating, and finding fault. And we felt the best way to change behavior was to catch somebody doing something right and praise it and reinforce it. So if a kid missed a tackle, you could say, Smith, you're the dumbest player I've ever coached. You ducked your head. We've told you 1,000 times, keep your head up. You're going to get hurt, and I hope you do get hurt. I hope they carry you off on a stretcher. And that's pretty negative. Another way to approach it would be say, Smith, you're normally a pretty good tackler. Remember what you got to do. You got to keep your head up, lock your arms, drive your feet. And the next time Smith does it right, you say, make a big deal out of it. Say, Smith, that is exactly what we're looking for. That's a picture of perfect tackle. So anyway, the player said that for the most part it was positive. I think that was good. Another thing they mentioned was how to handle adversity. And adversity is part of the human experience. Everybody faces it. Part of athletics. You're going to lose a game you didn't think you were going to. You're going to have injuries, all those kind of things. And it seemed to me that when people experience adversity, they react in one of three ways. One is to quit. Got passed over for promotion, I'm going to quit. Or at least I'm going to shut down mode. I'm going to quit trying real hard. You quit. Second thing is to blame. Not my fault. The coach is play's favorite. The boss is stupid. The teacher couldn't teach it anything. And so you point the finger. And the third way to deal with adversity is to look at it as an opportunity to learn something, an opportunity to get better. And so when we lost, the first thing we tried to do was to get on to the last point. How is this going to make us better? And so we'd won 26 games in a row at one point, and we got thinking we were pretty good. Went down to Arizona State, played a game in 1996. At the end of the evening, the score was 19-0, and they had the 19 and we had the nothing. So we came back to Nebraska. You'd think, well, Nebraska fans would be kind of forgiving. I mean, you won 26 in a row. And they said, well, everybody's going to lose one sometime. But it wasn't that way. The headline in the paper was, terrible team, dynasty's over, dumb coach, terrible quarterback, on and on. And so we got them all together on Monday. He said, this is the best thing that could have happened to us. Because we really got fat-headed. And there's some things that we can learn from this. And we're gonna work on this and this and this. We're gonna get better. We're gonna have a great team. This is gonna really be a catalyst to get us there. And so we could have been pointing the fingers at coaches, at players, players at coaches, offense at defense, and on. But I think for the most part, we never unraveled. We hardly ever lost 2 in a row. It's primarily because we tried to take that approach that one of the most instructive things in the world is adversity. Because when things are going good, you never change. But when you begin to hit a real big bump in the road, that's when everything's on the table. So there was this guy who lived about 150 years ago and was engaged to be married as a young man. His fiancée died suddenly. Went into depression. So depressed he couldn't get out of bed for 2 years. Wasn't any medication at that time. Finally he got better, decided to go into business. And business failed. And then decided he'd apply to law school, got rejected, started another business, that failed. And like a lot of people who don't do well in business, he went into politics. He lost his first election, his second, his third, his fourth, his fifth, his sixth, his seventh, his eighth. He was 0-8. He'd been a coach that would have fired him. And of course, by now you probably figured out that was Abraham Lincoln. And but the point was that he didn't quit. He didn't blame anybody else. But from every one of those experiences, he learned something, and he got better. He moved through the pain. And I think that's something that can be very instructive, is how you handle adversity. The last thing I'll mention to you, then I'll let you ask a few questions if you want to. The last thing I'll mention to you is the issue of balance. And the Greeks, about 4,000 years ago, said that a truly educated person was somebody who had balance in his or her life. And they said there are really three dimensions of human experience. There's the physical dimension. Remember, they had great athletes and they had the precursors of the Olympic Games. And so they were fairly adept people physically. Secondly, there's the intellectual dimension. Remember, they had mathematicians and scholars and philosophers and were very advanced in intellectual activity. Then they said the third dimension is the spiritual dimension. And they said anyone who's really functioning in all three areas and developed all three areas is a truly educated person. And of course, in our country, we tend to think of education when we're dealing with the intellect. But I thought about it because, our players always aspired to go into the National Football League, and they all were very concerned about the NFL draft. And most years we'd have 6, 7, 8, sometimes as many as 9 players drafted. And these guys had the American dream. Because the American dream, if you watch advertising, is to, number one, to have money. So 7th round pick will sign for $300,000. First round pick, 10 or 12 million. And so they had money. Secondly, is to have talent. They're probably in the upper 1/10 of 1% in terms of athletic ability. Thirdly, is to have celebrity. People want their autograph, want to hang around with them as celebrity. And fourth, something some of you have that I don't have anymore, and that's youth. So if you watch the ads, that's the whole deal, right? That's what's sold. And I thought about these guys because they were coming out of Nebraska, 22, 23, and they had everything that we're told will make you happy forever. And then I'd see them coming back, sometimes 3 years, 5 years, 10 years later. I was surprised because I would quite often see some people that were struggling, some people were broken, some people weren't doing very well. And I began to puzzle. We realized that some of them were one-dimensional. They knew how to block and they knew how to tackle. They knew where the weight room was. And they had really mastered the physical dimension. When the blocking and the tackling was over, there really wasn't anything else in their life that gave them any significance or purpose or meaning. And secondly, you say, well, most of them had degrees, and they did. They do okay. But if your whole identity from the time you were 10 or 12 years old was that of being a great athlete, that was who you were, that was your persona. Sometimes the knee injury or getting cut from the team was just as devastating as the kid that didn't have that second dimension. A lot of those guys struggled. And thirdly, I noticed that somebody who had a strong spiritual dimension had kind of learned the lesson that it wasn't all about me, myself, and I. And spirituality, you may say, well, I'm giving you some kind of a sermon. Spirituality really means that you've found something, a purpose or a cause, that you're willing to dedicate your life to that's more important than you. That's what spirituality is. And quite often it has to do with religion. Sometimes it has to do with a team. Sometimes it has to do with an organization. But we felt the spiritual dimension was really important, and I began to see that more and more. So we factored that in, and we began to have a pretty strong spiritual nucleus. And over time, we got to where we had a lot of players who really felt that the welfare of that team was more important than themselves. And that's kind of when you really can begin to take off, and you can really begin to excel. It wasn't every team, but some of our teams. Brooke Berringer was that kind of a guy. He was a guy who started his junior year, took us to the national championship. The next year he stood on the sideline, and he did the right thing, said the right thing, pulled things together, and it wasn't all about him. So we had a lot of those guys. So anyway, let me end by just telling you this story, you know. I don't want you to get the idea that I'm saying that we had this great culture and I did it because I was just part of it. But you know, I went back to Chicago in the early 1990s to speak to an alumni group like this. And I flew into O'Hare and I caught a cab going downtown. And I was kind of lost in my thoughts, and the cab driver turned to me and said, "Say, Mac," he said, "your name's Osborne, isn't it?" I was surprised. I said, "Yeah, it is." He said, "You may not remember this, but I picked you up 2 or 3 other times when you've come to Chicago." He said, "I'm always interested in speeches," so I've stood back and I've listened. He said, "You know, you always say the same thing." He said, "I'd give that speech better than you can." And I said, "Well, I'll shut this guy up." So I said, "Okay, you go ahead and give the speech." I thought he'd back off. He said, "No." He said, "I would love to do that." He said, "You know, we could change clothes. You can wear my cab driver's hat and jacket. I'll wear your sport coat and tie, and I'll give the speech, and you can stand back and listen." Well, I was kind of trapped. I'd committed myself, and I thought, well, this might work. He's a pretty nice looking fellow, looked a lot like me. So he got up and gave the speech, and he did a good job. And I was kind of surprised how well he did. Then he got a standing ovation. And then he got carried away with himself and he opened up for questions. And this one big alum stood up. He was red in the face. He was upset. He said, "Okay, Osborne," he said, "you've been the head coach there 21 years. You've never won a national championship. You've lost 7 straight bowl games, an all-time world record. How come?" Guy never batted an eye. I said, "That's a dumb question." So that's one of the dumbest questions I've ever heard. I said, "It's so stupid, I'm going to let my cab driver back." Anyway, so that's my story. Anyway, if you guys have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Maybe I've talked so long.
Brian, I'll start. There you go.
And we don't have to have this real long, just 2 or 3.
All right, I'll start. Then you guys jump in. So, Coach, I have had the honor of covering Nebraska football, and I covered Colorado football when I moved to Colorado, Bill McCartney's teams. And I remember interviewing Bill McCartney when he got here, and he had a picture above his desk of Folsom Field, and it was all red. The whole stadium was red. It was a Nebraska game. And he said, "That is going to change." And he said, "The way I'm going to change that is I'm going to make Nebraska a rival. They're going to be our rivalry." And to his credit, he did. And CU became very good under the Bill McCartney years. Did you ever consider CU a rival? How was that whole time with you and Nebraska?
Well, I guess, you know, I knew Bill when he was an assistant at Michigan, and we were friends, and so that was his choice. I always felt that rivalries should occur somewhat naturally, and usually it's because you play a lot of important games. And I think over a 30-year period, Nebraska and Oklahoma played for the championship or a tie for the championship 29 times out of 30 years. So they were a rival, and it was very natural. The Colorado thing, I thought, was maybe a little bit manufactured, and so they could say what they wanted. But to me, the next game was the rival, and the next game. So I never paid much attention to it, and I'm sorry it kind of got to be a negative thing out here. I don't know why. We always wanted people to be treated well in Lincoln, and but it was what it was. But I still correspond with Bill on occasion, and I think we get along okay. I congratulate him on his grandson being a good player. I saw him play this year. And I remember, Bob Church played. We played Colorado out here, and they had a guy named Wilmer Cooks, and Wilmer averaged about 10 yards a carry in the first half, and we were down 19-0, and it looked hopeless. And Colorado always treated us nice out here. At halftime, they had a hut that was made out of tin. The floor was dirt, and that's where we met at halftime. I remember going in there, and I thought, this is going to be 50-0. And Bob started throwing the ball, and that wasn't my style particularly, but we completed it, and all of a sudden we played better, and the final score was 21-19. And that was one of the more remarkable games. And of course, Jeff Kinney went through about 10 tearaways down to Oklahoma in 71. I remember Jeff. I recruited Jeff, probably just about blew it. In those days, you could take him fishing. I took him fishing. It was a cold day at Lake McConaughey. We didn't get a bite. That's it. I'm not going to see Jeff again. And, of course, Bill Cush, he led the world in punting. He played for us in 94, 95, 96, 97. And we punted once a game, once every year. When we had a strong wind at our back, we called timeout. We'd send Bill out and say punt. And so he led the world in punting. And I remember Calvin, I don't know if Calvin's still here or not, but we were down at, we beat Kansas 25 straight times, And but they got us to the point where it was 2 points. They were going to go for the win. And Calvin rushed for 207 yards that day. And so I remember these guys very well. So a lot of great memories and good experiences. So anything else you want to ask about?
There we go. I'll be right there.
Actually, Coach, I was one of the people that was happy that you didn't throw the ball a lot, because I felt like running the ball was our best way to win games. I mean, it's part of the culture in Nebraska is wearing the team down, and I love to see that running at the end of the game when picking up 10, 15 yards at a shot, and to me that was exciting. But my question is, so, I mean, you keep up with football probably more than I do, and why wouldn't the triple option work today?
Well, it would, and of course the zone read now is somewhat of a form of the option where there's one guy you don't block, you stick the ball in the halfback's stomach, you're doing it from the shotgun, and you're looking at the defensive end. If the defensive end comes down to crash and tackle the ball carrier, you keep it. And sometimes they have a pitch shot, most of the time they don't. So it's a little bit of a different style. But you notice those two plays that Barry and I had growing up were both option plays. And the thing that we learned a lot from Oklahoma, we got beat by Oklahoma quite a bit. And but we studied those films, and you might not understand it, but the thing that scared you more about playing Oklahoma than anything was the passing game. They might only throw the ball 5 times, but invariably they'd have guys 20, 30 yards behind everybody, because in order to play the option, you had to involve your safeties. You had to have a linebacker on the fullback, you had to have a tackle on the fullback, you had to have a defensive end on the pitch, you had to have a safety coming up on the pitch, you had to have 2 guys, because one of them was going to get blocked. And so pretty soon they'd run, and pretty soon your secondary would get all pushed out of shape. And all of a sudden somebody's 10, 20, 15 yards behind. So we most years led the Big 8 and the Big 12 in passing touchdowns. We didn't throw it as much as other people, but when we threw it, we killed people. And that was because the running game was so difficult. And people had to involve their secondary to stop the running game. They had to stop the option. And that left people one-on-one out there. So we felt it was important. And what our goal was to be more physical than the other team. So a lot of times in the first quarter, those runs would be 2 and 3 yards. In the second quarter, it'd be 4 and 5. third quarter would be maybe 5 or 6. Fourth quarter would be 7 or 8, and then once in a while you'd pop one. And that not only helped your offense, it also helped your defense. Because we would normally be on the field 10 to 15 fewer plays defensively than most other teams because we controlled the ball. And so that's why we did it. And part of it was weather. I mean, you're going to have wind. Wind is harder on a passing game than snow or cold weather. But we're going to have some bad weather games, and so we felt that was important. So anyway, that's what we did, and that was our identity, and we stayed with it. For the most part, it worked. Okay, one more question, and I'll sit down. Jeff wants to say something.
Hi, Coach. A comment was made earlier about how much you enjoy or love Colorado, or not love, that word wasn't used, but the question I have is, I recall there was a year when you came out, excuse me, and had an interview out here. What was your level of interest, or can you comment on that? Or was that maybe a year of a contract extension with those incidents?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not necessarily a comfortable question. But no, we were going along there, and quite a few years, I think the first 6 or 7 years, we, most years, except for maybe one, we were in the top 10 country, and we'd end up 10-2 or 9-3. And Nebraskans had been had been to Nirvana, and we'd won national championships. And that was the only standard, was national championship. Well, you're not going to win those every year. And so I began to think, well, maybe these people are getting ready to run me out of town. And at Colorado, 9-3, 10-2, probably looked pretty good. And the thing about Nebraska that's interesting is we didn't have a large population base, don't have any great geographical advantage. Not cornfields, we take guys from Florida and California and show them cornfields, and they don't get very excited. And we have cold weather, and we thought it might be easier to recruit out here. And so it's partly, I thought Nebraskans were getting tired of me, and partly we might have some advantages out here. And I went out here and we looked at it, and took Nancy and Eddie Crowder showed me around, and met the president of the school. But on the way back home, I got thinking, got a whole bunch of guys there in Lincoln that I recruited. And I made a commitment to those guys. And I don't know how I'm going to stand up in front of them and say, I'm going to go someplace now that's better for me. Because I felt I owed them something. And I wasn't going to back out on them. And so I realized that I couldn't do it. And really, I was a Nebraskan at heart, and so I took a look at it, but that was it. So I was there for very fortunate because I was in one place as a coach for 36 years, and in Division I athletics, the average Division I coach lasts 3 years. I mean, as assistants, they move, and so most of them, if they've been in coaching for 35 years, they've made 10 moves, different houses, different parts of the country. So to play and stay in one place for that long was unbelievable. And it was really nice for my family. And that's really where I wanted to be. So that was the end of it. Well, that's enough for me. Thank you guys for listening.
Coach, thank you. I think we speak for most of us when we say we're glad you didn't take the job at Colorado. Even though we live in Colorado.